In a world ruled by digital precision, where every path is plotted by satellites and every movement calculated by algorithms, one man still believed in the power of a simple sheet of paper. His name was Harold Brooks, a quiet, elderly Army veteran with hands that once shaped the unseen roots of survival. At a modern geospatial seminar filled with glowing screens and confident young analysts, Harold sat silently in the back row. The crowd spoke of automation, of drones, of data that never lies. They spoke with certainty, the kind born of technology, not experience. And when someone noticed the old man holding a rolled paper map, a ripple of amusement passed through the room. To them, he was a symbol of the past, a man who drew lines when machines could draw worlds. A whisper escaped. "Paper maps in 2025? Harold heard it and simply smiled. His fingers rested on the worn edges of the map he carried, one he had crafted long ago under a flickering lamp in a place the world had almost forgotten. No one there knew what those lines had meant. No one realized that each stroke of ink had once been a lifeline, a guide through regions where compasses spun uselessly and satellites couldn't see. The room buzzed with confidence, but the man with the pen and paper carried something far greater, a quiet truth. Decades earlier, that very map had guided a convoy through uncharted terrain during a critical mission. It was a piece of art born not of technology, but of intuition, courage, and sleepless nights. It had saved lives, countless lives, by being exactly what it was: imperfect, human, and true. Now, in a world obsessed with speed and accuracy, Harold's legacy stood on the edge of dismissal. He didn't come seeking recognition. He came to listen, to learn, and perhaps to remind himself that the world still had room for craftsmanship and faith. But as fate would have it, his presence would soon challenge everything those experts believed. Because when his old map was finally unrolled, the laughter would stop. And in its silence, they would all learn what true precision really means. The auditorium gleamed with the confidence of a new age. Giant screens displayed satellite grids, glowing in layers of data, while animated presenters spoke of innovation as if it were a conquest. Words like real-time mapping, AI terrain prediction, and automated route optimization filled the air with excitement. Harold Brooks sat 3 rows from the back, a small notebook resting on his knee, his old army cap folded beside him. His jacket bore no medals, only a faint patch from a unit long deactivated, a quiet symbol of days when maps were drawn by hand, not generated by code. Around him, young professionals exchanged smirks as they noticed his worn leather map case. To them, it looked ancient, something fit for a museum, not a modern symposium. "Can you imagine navigating with that?" one whispered, shaking his head. Another laughed softly. "Guess he missed the digital age." Harold heard them, but his expression didn't change. His eyes, pale and steady, followed each slide on the screen. For him, maps had always been more than coordinates. They were stories, lives connected by fragile paths through the unknown. When the speaker asked for audience participation, a young engineer raised his hand and joked, "Maybe our guest here can tell us what it was like before satellites existed." Laughter filled the room, light but cutting. All eyes turned to Harold. He stood slowly, not with anger but with a calm that silenced the noise around him. His voice was low, measured, the kind that carried the weight of time. "Before satellites," he said, "we trusted observation, intuition, and each other. We didn't always have the right tools, but we had to be right anyway." The room grew still. The speaker, suddenly uneasy, forced a polite smile. "That's an interesting perspective, sir." Harold nodded and sat down, opening his notebook as if the exchange had never happened. Inside were faint sketches, topographical lines drawn in pencil, rivers and elevations that spoke to anyone fluent in the language of patience. A few seats away, a young intern named Sarah watched him curiously. Unlike the others, she didn't laugh. She saw the steadiness in his hand, the precision in each line. Something about him felt different, not outdated, but enduring. When the seminar concluded, a presentation from the Army's Historical Division was announced. They were to showcase classic cartography, examples of maps that had guided early operations. As the curator unrolled one delicate parchment, the audience leaned forward. The signature on the corner was barely visible but unmistakable. H. Brooks. Sarah's eyes widened. The old man in the back row wasn't just an observer. He was the creator. And for the first time that day, silence replaced laughter. Harold's hands told a story long before his voice ever did. They were calloused, steady, and slightly ink-stained. The kind of hands that had learned the discipline of patience. Every wrinkle along his knuckles carried the memory of lines drawn under dim lamps where silence was not emptiness but concentration. He once believed that if he could map the land well enough, he could protect the men who trusted his lines. That belief became his mission. During his years in the army, he was not on the front lines, at least not in the way people imagined. His battlefield was a drafting table, a compass, a ruler, and endless sheets of parchment. Each map he made began the same way, with observation, calculation, and quiet reverence for the terrain. He would spend hours tracing the slope of a ridge or the curve of a river, imagining the feet that would one day follow it. To him, the land spoke, in textures, shadows, and subtleties invisible to machines. Many called him the ghost cartographer, because few ever met him during operations. His maps arrived sealed and precise, with coordinates so accurate that entire convoys navigated through uncertainty without loss. He never sought recognition, and in truth, he preferred anonymity. The only reward he wanted was the knowledge that his work brought others home safely. But there was one mission, one that would forever define him. It took place in an uncharted region, a place where storms erased landmarks and compasses spun without mercy. Technology failed, signals vanished, and yet his map, hand-drawn, tested only by intuition and faith, became the thread that led an entire unit back to safety. That night, after confirmation that every soldier had returned, Harold sat alone by the faint glow of his desk lamp. He placed his pen down and stared at the map, edges worn from use. A faint tremor passed through him, not of pride, but of relief. The paper before him wasn't just a chart. It was a record of survival, a quiet testament to trust between those who walk the earth and those who guide them unseen. Now, decades later, as his map was unrolled before a new generation, Harold's heart stirred with a mixture of nostalgia and apprehension. Would they understand what those lines meant? Would they feel the weight of human effort behind each contour and symbol? Sarah, watching from across the room, could sense it, the silent depth in his eyes. She didn't yet know the full story, but she could feel the gravity of his presence as if the world had paused to remember something important. The mapmaker's hands may have aged, but the truth they once held remained steady. Real courage often lives in silence, drawn line by those who never ask to be seen. Long before the quiet seminar room, before the applause and the data screens, there were the endless fields of dust and wind. Harold remembered them not as a place of danger, but as a landscape of purpose, a place where men relied on one another, and where a single line on a page could mean the difference between hope and despair. He could still recall the low hum of engines, the smell of oil and earth, the sound of boots pressing into uncertain soil. There were nights when the stars were his only companions, pinpoints of light guiding him as he charted the unknown. He never carried a weapon. His instruments were compasses, pencils, and rulers, yet his work carried a weight no less vital. Each operation began with silence. Teams waited for his instructions, trusting his drawings more than the failing equipment. The terrain shifted constantly, sand swallowing markers, wind carving new ridges overnight. But Harold's maps adapted with human intuition, something no algorithm could replicate. One night during a particularly critical mission, communication lines went down. Visibility dropped to nothing. A young officer, panicked, had whispered, "Sir, the instruments are dead." And Harold, with a calm that steadied everyone around him, had simply unfolded his hand-drawn chart and pointed to a faint line that traced a safer route through the valley. They followed it, step by step, hour by hour, until the first dawn light touched the horizon. When they finally reached the extraction point, the relief was so overwhelming that no one spoke. They just looked at him, the quiet cartographer whose steady pen had guided them home. He never told that story publicly. The mission was classified, the records sealed, the maps filed away under operations that would never be mentioned. But those who lived through it never forgot his name. For them, Brooks' line became more than a path. It was a promise. Now, as he watched the audience in the seminar room glance over his old map, the very one from that mission, Harold could almost hear the echoes of those long-ago voices: gratitude, exhaustion, and awe. The paper had aged, but the ink still held its strength just as he did. Sarah leaned closer to the display, tracing a contour with her eyes. "This wasn't just a map," she murmured to herself. "It's a memory." Across the room, Harold caught her whisper and nodded faintly. In that brief moment, the years between them dissolved. She saw him not as an artifact, but as a living bridge between what was once done by hand and what is now trusted to machines. And deep within her, a quiet respect began to take root, a sense that perhaps progress had forgotten something sacred. When the lights dimmed for the next panel, the tone of the seminar shifted. The moderator, a confident man in his 30s, smiled toward the audience and said, "Today, we explore how traditional mapping compares to modern geospatial intelligence. Are hand-drawn methods still relevant?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. A few chuckles rose from the front rows, the same people who had laughed earlier. Sarah felt a knot form in her chest. She glanced toward Harold, who remained still, his weathered fingers resting gently on the edge of his notebook. The moderator gestured toward the display table where Harold's map lay, carefully mounted under glass. "This," he said, "is an example of legacy craftsmanship. Beautiful, yes, but imagine the inefficiency. Imagine relying on this instead of live satellite feeds." Laughter rippled through the room again. Someone added, "We'd still be lost in the desert." The crowd erupted briefly, comfortable in their certainty. Harold's eyes remained calm. His silence seemed to carry more authority than all their noise combined. Sarah felt something stir inside her, a quiet anger at the ease with which the young dismissed what they didn't understand. She raised her hand before she even realized it. "Excuse me," she said, her voice clear. "Before we dismiss that map, maybe we should understand what it actually represents. Does anyone here know who made it?" The moderator hesitated, caught off guard. "It's part of the Army's historical collection," he replied. No specific attribution on the display. Sarah stood, her gaze steady. "Then maybe it's time we learn. Because the signature on that map, the one in the corner you can barely see, belongs to Mr. Harold Brooks. He's sitting right here." The room turned. Dozens of eyes fixed on the old man in the back. A murmur spread, this time not of laughter, but of disbelief. The moderator blinked. You're the cartographer?" Harold rose slowly. His voice was measured and humble. "I was," he said simply. "Once." For a long moment, no one spoke. The same map they had mocked now felt heavier, charged with unspoken reverence. Someone near the front leaned closer to the glass, examining the delicate lines anew. Harold continued quietly, "I'm glad technology has advanced. It should. But precision was never only about tools. It was about responsibility, about ensuring that every path drawn meant safety for someone far from home." The room fell silent. Even the moderator seemed unsure how to continue. The laughter had evaporated, replaced by reflection. Sarah watched him return to his seat, heart pounding with a strange pride. She didn't yet know the full scope of what he had done, but one truth was clear. Relevance wasn't about age or innovation. It was about integrity. And Harold Brooks had more of it in his quiet humility than most people in that shining room. When the seminar broke for lunch, the crowd scattered in clusters, bright screens glowing in every hand, conversations buzzing about software and sensors. Harold stayed behind. He sat quietly, eyes fixed on the map beneath the glass. Each line he had drawn decades ago still spoke to him. The rivers, the elevation marks, the faint pencil notes on the edges, they were like fingerprints of a younger self. His mind drifted to the long nights when those lines were born, when the world was uncertain and every decision mattered. He remembered a tent illuminated by a single lantern, the smell of coffee gone cold, and the rustle of wind through the canvas walls. Outside, teams prepared for movement through territory no one had ever charted. Inside, Harold worked by instinct. There were no satellite images, no drones to confirm terrain. Just memory, compass readings, and faith in human observation. He had always believed that maps were living things, that they carried the pulse of the people who relied on them. Each contour, each faint mark of ink, was drawn with care for lives unseen. He knew that if a single line was misplaced, a single valley misjudged, it could mean chaos. And so he never hurried. Every stroke was an act of devotion. But there was one memory that lingered more vividly than the rest. He recalled the moment his commanding officer placed a trembling hand on his shoulder and said, "You've done more than you know, Brooks." It wasn't said with ceremony, but with quiet relief. Behind those words lay the unspoken truth, that his work had delivered them from something unspeakably close. He never saw that officer again, but those words became his compass for the rest of his life. "You've done more than you know." Back in the present, Harold smiled faintly. The years had changed everything. Tools, methods, even the way people spoke of duty. But not the essence of service. His map wasn't art or nostalgia. It was a record of care, of accountability to others. Sarah approached him softly, holding a coffee cup in both hands. "Mr. Brooks," she said, hesitant but sincere. "That map you made, it's extraordinary." He looked up, surprised by the warmth in her tone. "It's just ink on paper," he replied gently. She shook her head. "No, sir. It's proof that precision isn't about technology. It's about attention and heart." For a moment, Harold said nothing. Then he nodded, eyes reflecting both gratitude and melancholy. "Attention and heart," he repeated. "That's what it's always been about." Outside, the wind carried a low hum against the building's steel frame, a sound not unlike the distant echoes of the past. And as Harold listened, the lines of memory he'd once drawn seemed to come alive again, whispering softly that true craftsmanship never fades. The afternoon session began with renewed energy. The crowd returned to their seats, expecting more discussions on software updates and digital mapping tools. But when the host stepped to the podium, his tone had shifted. "Before we proceed," he began, "we've just received a note from the Department of Defense Historical Records Division. It concerns one of the maps featured in today's presentation, specifically, the hand-drawn chart signed by Harold Brooks." A ripple of curiosity moved through the audience. Harold looked up slowly, his eyes calm but cautious. Sarah leaned forward, sensing something important was about to unfold. The host adjusted his glasses and continued reading. "It appears that this particular map, catalog number BR47, was used during a classified navigation mission that ensured the survival of multiple units in an uncharted region during a high-risk operation. Records indicate that electronic systems failed during that period, and that manual navigation, based on this very map, enabled successful extraction." He paused. The room was silent. "The Army has now confirmed that this chart was not only accurate beyond contemporary standards, but it also became a model for future terrain analysis training. In recognition of its impact, the Defense Cartographic Archives have designated it as a legacy map of honor." Gasps filled the auditorium. The crowd turned to Harold, whose modest posture seemed unchanged despite the weight of the words spoken about him. For decades, his achievement had remained hidden beneath layers of bureaucracy and time. And now, under the soft glow of stage lights, it was finally seen. The host looked directly at him. "Mr. Brooks, on behalf of all present, thank you for your service and for reminding us that true precision is timeless." Applause began slowly, almost uncertainly, then grew into a standing ovation. The sound filled the room, echoing against the glass and steel, warm and human amid the technology. Sarah watched him rise, humble, slightly overwhelmed, but dignified. His eyes glistened, not with pride, but with quiet acceptance. He nodded once toward the stage. "I was only doing my part," he said softly. The host smiled. "Sometimes doing your part changes everything." As the clapping continued, Sarah noticed how the digital maps projected on the screen, filled with layers and coordinates, suddenly looked cold beside Harold's paper creation. His work wasn't just a map. It was a promise, drawn with intention, care, and love for lives unknown. For the first time, the room saw beyond data. They saw the humanity that technology could never replicate. And as Harold sat back down, he could feel the faint tremor in his hands again, not from age, but from the echo of memories finally finding peace. When the applause faded, a calm settled over the room. The kind of silence that feels sacred, like a shared breath after a revelation. Harold remained seated, his eyes fixed on the map still displayed at the front. The glass reflected his face, and for the first time he saw himself not as a remnant of the past, but as part of something larger, a continuum of care, precision, and quiet service. Around him, the audience whispered softly, no longer with derision but with awe. Words like incredible, unbelievable, and honor floated through the air. Yet Harold felt no surge of pride, only a deep stillness. Recognition after all these years did not feel like triumph. It felt like closure. Sarah approached him again, this time with no hesitation. "Mr. Brooks," she said gently, "you changed how I see everything we do here." He smiled faintly. "I didn't change anything, miss. You just saw what was always there." She hesitated, then asked, "Why didn't you ever tell anyone what you'd done?" Harold looked down at his hands, those same steady hands that once drew the paths of survival. "Because maps aren't about the map maker," he said softly. "They're about those who need them. The moment a map saves a life, it belongs to someone else." His words lingered in the air, heavy and true. Sarah felt a warmth rise in her chest, a realization that humility, the kind she saw in him, was a form of greatness rarely understood in her generation. A few of the senior engineers approached to thank him personally. One admitted, "Sir, I've trusted digital systems my whole career. I never thought a pencil and paper could outsmart them." Harold chuckled gently. "It wasn't about outsmarting," he said. "It was about understanding. Machines see the surface, people feel the terrain." They stood quietly, digesting his words. For many in that room, the afternoon had become more than a seminar. It was a moment of reckoning. They had witnessed the living embodiment of devotion without recognition, of work done not for applause, but for purpose. As the day drew to a close, the hall emptied, leaving Harold and Sarah by the display. The light from the setting sun fell across the glass, illuminating the faint ink lines of the old chart. It almost seemed alive. The rivers gleaming, the ridges glowing softly, the signature H. Brooks catching the last trace of daylight. Harold whispered, almost to himself, "Time moves on, but the land remembers. Every path we mark leaves a trace." Sarah placed a hand over the glass. "And now we remember too." The weight of silence around them wasn't empty anymore. It was full, of gratitude, of understanding, and of the timeless bond between those who serve quietly and those who finally learn to see them. A week later, the seminar hall stood quiet again. The banners had been taken down, the screens dimmed, and the chairs neatly stacked. Yet something had changed, an invisible imprint left by one man's story. Sarah sat alone at her desk in the research wing, surrounded by monitors filled with topographic layers and digital scans. On one of the screens, she had pulled up a high-resolution image of Harold's map. She zoomed in, tracing the delicate lines that had once guided men through uncertainty. The craftsmanship was unlike anything she had ever studied. Patient, deliberate, almost reverent. She remembered his words. "Machines see the surface, People feel the terrain. They echoed in her mind like a quiet anthem. Moved by that truth, Sarah began a new project, a digital archive she titled the Human Cartography Initiative. Its purpose was simple but profound: to preserve and teach the principles of manual mapping, combining technology with the intuition and compassion that guided the old masters. The first entry was Harold's map, catalogued not as an artifact, but as a living lesson. When she sent him an email explaining her idea, Harold replied in just a few lines, "I'm honored, but promise me one thing. Never let the tools matter more than the people they serve." She smiled when she read it. That sentence became the initiative's official motto. A month later, Sarah invited Harold to visit the research center again. This time there was no crowd, no stage, no applause. Just a small gathering of students and young engineers waiting quietly as he entered. On the wall behind them, projected in soft light, was the phrase, "Guided by heart, perfected by hand, the legacy of Harold Brooks." He looked up at the words, his eyes glistening. "That's too much credit," he murmured. Sarah shook her head gently. "No, sir, it's exactly enough." After the presentation, she handed him a framed print of his original map, restored, mounted, and accompanied by a plaque that read, "In gratitude for lives guided safely home." Harold held it in silence, his fingertips brushing the familiar contours. "It's strange," he said softly. "You spend a lifetime drawing paths for others, and one day, someone draws one for you." They stood together for a while, watching as students gathered around to study his work, not as a relic but as inspiration. The faint smell of ink and paper still lingered in the room, mixing with the hum of computers, bridging past and present in quiet harmony. For Harold Brooks, that moment wasn't about legacy or recognition. It was about continuity, proof that even in a digital world, humanity still traced its journey with heart. And as he left the building, the evening light spilling over the harbor, the old cartographer smiled. His map had guided others once before, and now, in a new way, it would continue to do so. Long after the seminar ended, people still spoke of the man with the paper map. His name appeared in articles, in classrooms, and in quiet conversations among those who once believed technology had no room for the human hand. But Harold Brooks never sought the spotlight. He returned to his modest home, his days simple, his workbench still covered with old rulers, faded notes, and a single sharpened pencil, ready, as if he might draw one last line. Every so often, he received letters from young engineers and soldiers alike. They thanked him for reminding them that precision isn't just a matter of numbers, but of care, that every calculation, every design, every decision carries the weight of a life depending on it. He replied to few of them, but he read them all, quietly humbled. Harold knew that what he had left behind wasn't just a map. It was a way of seeing, a belief that even in an age of automation, humanity must remain at the center of creation. For him, the lines on the page had always been a reflection of something deeper, the courage to be responsible for others, even when no one is watching. And so his story reminds us that heroism doesn't always wear medals or command attention. Sometimes it lives in the steady hands of those who build, protect, and guide without ever asking for credit. If Harold Brooks' journey moved you, if it made you pause and remember the invisible hands that keep the world steady, take a moment to honor them. Like, share, and subscribe to keep their stories alive, so that the quiet heroes among us are never forgotten. Because some maps don't just guide us through places, they guide us toward who we're meant to be.